got to think about what's going on next. So, I want to watch your
I don't want to contaminate. I think distance, safe distance.
You don't like that?
Bueno, está bien, pero si vas a tomar una,
At a business school, it's about like 200,000, and, you know.
Okay, folks, so unfortunately for you, it's me today. Professor Ashraf called late last night saying he's got 104 fever, and his son is not well too, so yeah, it's a nice experience. We spent some time on the phone, and the decision was to move ahead with the syllabus and touch on this important topic because we're a couple of lectures behind. And he's going to be here hopefully on Thursday. We're going to have Professor Ricardo Hausman coming in too in a couple of weeks. But I'm actually excited and honored to be able to talk to you today about this topic. So, moving ahead, who is this man? Malthus. Yeah. It's Reverend Malthus. What was his theory?
Is this recording?
That eventually human population would exceed so quickly that resources couldn't keep up with it.
So Malthus was actually, he wrote a series of essays between 1798 and the 1820s, basically coming up with the insight that became the underpinning for a lot of evolutionary biologists, that the power of population is so superior to the power of the resources of the earth that premature death, war, and famine would check population in place. Now, it seems very intuitive right now, but remember at that time there wasn't really census data to get world population, right? So he actually, amongst the limited data that he had, he was let's see the chart, but he actually saw that the population of Britain was going up, and it would circularly come down, and then again it would reach a limit, again it would go up, then again it would come down. And he saw these patterns, so he came up with this theory at that time, which was quite revolutionary, right? And basically, if you actually take a look at, we've seen these graphs before, at the population growth and the GDP per capita growth, it's phenomenal how much of it has happened over the last century. Right, so I think some of you are aware of this, that it took, since the beginning of civilization until the 18th century to get to the first billion. Then it took another 125 years to get to the next billion. Then it actually took another 35 years to get from 2 to 3 billion. Then it took another 24 years to get from 3 to 4 billion. Then it was 13 years, and then 12 years in the last billion. So actually combined with Malthus's theory in 1960, there was a really interesting paper that came out by two authors at Stanford University, Ehrlich and Ehrlich. And they actually wrote this paper called The Population Bomb that caused quite a stir in society. Has anyone read this paper for another class or knows anything about it? Yeah.
I haven't read it, but as I understand it, they said that population growth would eventually reach a limit that the resources would not be able to provide for that population, and there would be a great famine reaching the 70s, I think. The population would, resources would not be able to provide for everyone.
So what happened is till the 1960s, right? There was a point where population was growing incredibly, but some of those jumps in technological advancement and also the demographic shifts when people chose to have lesser children wasn't seen. So at that time, this paper caused a lot of alarm, but just looking at the trends and looking at the growth, you know, that even from baby boomers and all at that time, that there would have to be something drastic that would happen to Earth. And there was a lot of predictions at that time of what would happen in the 1990s and in 2000s. And then the same authors have revised and written a paper again in 2010. And then there was another author by the name of Baird, who again wrote about why this population bomb didn't happen. Right? So are there any thoughts on what happened here? Why is there a belief that going forward that so the World Bank predicts that the population right now is 7.1 billion, that will not exceed between 10 and 11 billion ever. Why is that? What happened?
Fertility rates are falling.
population will stabilize at some level, possibly lower than another?
So, so this is really interesting. That's exactly, that's one of the criteria. I mean, the theory that Professor Kumrol and Professor Hausman have gone through it is that there was a shift at some point in terms of the investment in children, right? And the importance of education. So in pre-industrial times, there was the sense that the investment in education does not necessarily lead to greater output. So as we'll come to the Malthusian model, the thought was, the more money you have, the more kids that you want to have, right? And that changed at some point. So it's remarkable if you actually think about, the population growth. We did this Adam and Eve example at the first class, right? That if the population growth was just 1% per year from the time Adam and Eve was supposed to be born 5,700 years ago, just followed a 1% trajectory, that the population today would be 2.55 trillion times the current population we have now. I'm just, I'm flabbergasted when I think about this. I mean, this is something that it's not been that intuitive to me. So what happened in all these years? I mean, Malthus, right now his theory seems to some people too extreme. But in effect, this really had happened through the centuries. That there was a correction for the actual growth to be as low as we've seen in history. Yeah? We've seen this slide before too. I mean, you see that most of the world growth in GDP per capita has happened in the last century. Stop me if there's any questions. Now, we've seen this before too. Right? The Western offshoots are US, Canada. We've seen Western Europe, but there's been a huge difference. There's been a divergence from the 1820s onwards, from Malthusian times, in terms of how fast countries have developed in terms of GDP per capita. Cesar, what's your opinion on what's happened to Africa in the 1820s? What are your thoughts?
I cannot really say what happened there. I'm trying to explain it by so many historical issues, like the colonialism, the slavery, and the lack of productivity.
Lack of productivity. Right. We talked a little bit about imperialism in the second class,
Yes.
right? Any other thoughts on what's happened in, why have the Western offshoots shot? I mean, there's, yeah.
Well, I guess the Industrial Revolution took hold in Western Europe around the late 19th century, and that didn't quite flow through to Asia and Africa until much later.
Why is that?
I don't know. I guess perhaps the extent of trade wasn't nearly the same as it is today.
Mm-hmm. So the central question, I think we've, last time this came up in last year's class a lot, that the central question of this country, of this class is why are some countries poor, unequal, and volatile, right? And a lot of time the answer is we don't really know. But what economists like Hausman have done is that they've tried to isolate factors over different times, do a lot of regressions to kind of what correlate and come up with a set of factors that are all responsible. But I think the thing to appreciate in this area is that there has been a lot of divergence, and that the Solo model, which is a model that's supposed to theoretically explain how a phenomenon happened, did explain a part of history at some point, and there's been some shift. That's why it's really interesting to study this. If we had the answers, there wouldn't be a subject in this area. Right? But the contrasts are significant. We've seen this before too. We talked a little bit about the population growth rate, and there was 1.6 billion people alive in 1900, and there's exactly the opposite, 6.1 billion people alive in 2000. They say that in 1980, right, 75% of people that ever lived were alive at that time. So again, we've seen, this is really interesting correlation. We talk about the explosion in population growth in the last century, but then the quality of life has also significantly increased. Right? And the GDP per capita has also followed this trajectory of growing incredibly fast since the Industrial Revolution, the post-Malthusian era. We're seeing this correlation too, right? The population growth is negatively correlated with GDP per capita. Okay, there's a little bit of a chicken and egg theory here, right? But in general, classical economics will have stated that as the population grows, there is less money to be divided between the population, and the GDP will actually fall. Okay, so the basic idea of the Malthusian model is that the population growth is constrained by the means of subsistence. This is a very important underpinning of this principle. What are some thoughts on this? Has anyone here has spent some time looking at Malthus's papers on population and demography? What is a thought on this principle?
Well, I don't know that much about his theory, but didn't he think that the population would max out at a much lower level than it is currently? So he thought that, I don't know what the number was, but he thought that the resources would constrain growth much earlier, and we've seen that resources will sustain growth to the level that they are now. But I think there is some truth to his theory in that, we use limited resources now, it's affecting standard of living and development and all that stuff in the world.
Yeah, so there's, so in the last 40 years, just back to kind of Ehrlich's paper and the response to it, right? That the rate of technological advancement, he actually laid in his paper, he actually lists 6 different factors. He talks about some economic factors and then about some of the sociographic factors too. Part of it is that, he argues that free markets have started functioning better. So that when there's a greater demand for, say, corn, the farmers will grow more corn. And this responsiveness with global markets has been sharper than ever before. Right? He also talks about some of the societal factors where he says that there was a shift at this point where people chose to have less children because they started to, again, correlate the value, they started to see the value of education on outcomes. But let's just go through just a couple of graphs. This is, as someone said, they're going to shoot me if I go into calculus today, but we'll keep with the graphs right now. So this is a very interesting sort of derivation of Malthus's model. Playing with okay. What is this graph telling you, according to classical Malthusian economics? Max, what are your thoughts?
Correlation between death rate and welfare per capita.
Why? Can you explain it?
Well, presumably, if you're dying, you can't make money, so.
Okay, so it goes with the income is causing the change in death rate. So the classical philosophy was, as an economy starts getting richer, as the income per capita goes up, technological advances come in, and the death rate goes down. That's one part of this equation. Yeah. And then here, an opposite phenomenon is happening with the birth rate. Oops. What's happening here? What's the philosophy here? Yeah.
The richer you get, the more resources you have to be able to provide for a family, so you have more babies.
Yes, and that is so different from what we're experiencing today, right? Yeah.
And also, isn't the idea as well, was that you needed that labor from extra children?
Exactly. And was this intuitive to people? That during the times of the Industrial Revolution, there was a sense that the more income you have, the more children you want to produce. A lot of times you saw an aristocratic family, the families were really large, but in fact for poorer people, there was a high level of infant mortality, so they would have 1 or 2 children. Whereas the aristocrats, as they were richer, they would have 5 to 6 on average. Right? This is very different from what's happening in industrialized economies today. So you put these 2 graphs together. Let me walk you through this intuition.
So the shift happened after the Industrial Revolution?
Yeah, so this is really interesting thing. In fact, it happened much more in the last 50 years, right? That people, and Professor Kumral's argument is that the value of education was correlated with better income, and people started perceiving that it makes sense to invest in children. This whole investment in children theory that has led to this change. Clearly there's a number of different factors playing, right? So let's take a look at the intuition of this graph right here. Okay, so what's happening here? Has anyone seen this before in another class? What's happening here? So according to classical Malthusian economics, right? And this is, right now we're talking about this whole Malthusian trap. And then the second part of this lecture is how in modern society, certain countries, in fact most countries have escaped the Malthusian trap. And so what's happening here is that if we combine both of the graphs, as income increases, okay, the death rate is going down and the birth rate is going up. Yeah, yes, Izzy?
We can say the death rate bring the population rate down. Putting the population rate down. It's a major driver of the population rate.
The death rate and the birth rate, right? So as income grows, the death rate comes down.
So the birth rate is a major driver. Of the
Is the, sorry?
Is the main driver of the population rate.
So just so you know, when Malthus was kind of talking about his theory, he talked about two types of shocks that would correct the economy. Anyone aware of what those are? Two types of shocks. The positive shocks and the preventive shocks. Now interestingly, a positive shock is death, famine, and disease, according to Malthus, right? And a preventive shock to the economy is things like birth control, you know, celibacy, preventing kind of, you know, lowering the number of children. It's these two shocks that have historically, at least, you know, from the time of, beginning of time till the late 18th century, kept the world in balance. And I think this is a very powerful phenomenon. I grew up in India, and then, you know, to a large extent, I feel a lot of the current issues of society, a lot of the corruption that happens is a function of just too many people for fewer resources. And if people were to ask me, what do you think is the number one issue, that you could fix in your country, it'd be finding a way to probe and think about population. It was clearly the largest kind of, population control program in the world after China in the 70s and 80s. But what are some more thoughts on this? I mean, I think there's not a lot of different concepts to go through, but there's, I feel in each class if we absorb one concept really well, and I'll come back at the end to solve on kind of, what we really want to kind of take away with us and remember it for life. I think it's really helpful. So this was, right now, again, these theories, like we were talking last time, they've explained economics in the past, but they've been really the cornerstone of understanding why modern economics has deviated from how phenomena were explained in the past, and what are the reasons for that deviation. Okay, so the intersection of these two curves leads to an equilibrium income per capita. Yeah, Dave.
I don't really understand the first graph. You're saying that, okay, if the death rates are falling, automatically population is growing because the death rates are falling.
No, the population grows in that area between the intersection and the birth and the death rate.
Right. To me, it sounds like population will grow in the whole area because the death rates are falling and the so you mean to say, okay, I see.
Yeah, that's it.
Right.
So basically, if you shock the economy, right, and you increase the per capita income, so there's a technological advance. Like in the Chinese dynasties, there was a time where there were certain innovations that actually increased the per capita income for a while. In the short term, and for a specific generation, there will be higher income per capita, but then the forces of birth and death rate will bring it back to its equilibrium.
Sure.
Yeah?
Just on the upper graph, when it mentions in this area population falls, it looks like this like the case of poor countries or poor societies, poor economies, and the opposite on the right side.
So you're saying on the left side is what happens typically to more industrialized economies?
No, less.
Exactly. Right? So because a lot of this, you have to keep the intuition in mind. This is all income per capita, right? The overall wealth will increase in a nation as the population grows, right? But according to Solow, there's diminishing returns to the capital. And what happens to the average welfare for a person? That's how you judge the performance of a country. This has been the standard statistic through history to think about the progress of a country. Income per capita. This again underlies Solow's model too, right? Income per capita. So this is the Malthusian trap, right? as the population grows, you get technology, you get shocks, the population grows, but then there is less, there's income per capita, again, correct itself. Because of fixed resources for land and other constraints we're holding, right? And then what's happened in the last 50 years is that there's been significant technological increases, as well as in the fertility of the land, and in sort of using the land, there's also been advancement. Then the question is, can you sustain that? Yeah, Omar, right?
Yeah, so I had a question in regards to the Malthusian model and the demographic transition model as well. Because what it states is that naturally you only have the 3 phases.
Mm-hmm.
The second phase is where the death rates start going down and
Yep.
the birth rates are up, and the last phase, both of them go down and the population starts to balance out.
Can you just explain that to the class? So that the
Yeah, so
phases-
the demographic transition model is essentially a theory that states that there are 3 phases for countries.
Mhm.
The initial phase is when country is poor and still developing, and in that phase, population growth rate is high, the growth rate is high and the death rate is high as well. And the second phase is the transitional phase, like countries like Peru are in that phase, in which the death rate still starts getting low,
Mhm.
the population growth rate still remains high, and in the final stage, essentially both of them become low, and you have the population starts balancing out. So how does that fit into with
That's
this?
the latter part of this presentation. But let me just explain. So at a more, taking it even down one more level, basically as countries increase their income per capita, right? What happens first is that the death rate comes down. So this is a phenomenon that you've seen across developing countries, even like malaria, AIDS, kind of you've seen the treatment for that. As the world gets richer, as these countries get more resources, the governments are a little more active in kind of creating prevention programs, care support treatment programs for AIDS, malaria, and so basically the death rate is what first starts to come down. Right? So there's a convergence. The birth rate stays more or less the same. The death rate is coming down. At this point, when the death rate is the lowest and the birth rate is more or less the same, is when you have the highest population. Right? Then, over time, the birth rate also starts to come down. As people realize that there's greater value in having fewer children, as we've seen in all the industrialized countries. And that's typically when they're both declining, is when you have the equilibrium of population. The difference between birth and death rates. This is the kind of the modern day phenomenon.
So let me ask you.
Yeah.
Are you trying to say, so with what you just said now, that means the Malthusian world theory was wrong initially?
As people would say about Solo too. It explained a lot of the world for a very long time, right? But we, in recent times, have escaped what is called the Malthusian trap.
How did you do that?
That's what this course is about, right? And I'll come to a couple. There's a number of factors, right? So what are the intuitive ones? Technology.
Green revolution.
Yep.
Huge.
Yeah.
Probably
And
the single most important.
that's what Baird argues, But again, the growth has been also capped. The value of the green revolution has already been realized. And that's what the population bomb paper was talking about too, that this will happen, but then what's going to happen after?
Although, even so, green revolution, the production numbers are still higher, so much higher than consumption. And now it's a matter of how do I get it where it's needed.
So in 1960s, the thought was population is going to grow, continue to grow at an exponential rate, but the resources are going to grow at more of a, like a factor. And what we actually saw is that so far, since between 1960 and 2010, the green revolution and productivity increases have grown at even a faster exponential rate. So there's a lot of these theories. It's a very interesting topic today. There's a lot of theorists. You would call the pessimists who believe that, again, resources are going to be limited. A lot of the concerns in climate change kind of stem from this theory that we're really taking a lot out of the earth, and then we've kind of reached our potential. But the same sentences, the same words were said 40, 50 years ago.
Good question. So according to the Malthusian model, when there's an equilibrium between birth rate and death rate, how does it correlate then on the bottom graph with growth, population growth?
So basically the bottom graph is actually showing income per capita, and according to the same logic, it's saying that the more income there is, the population declines. Okay, and we'll use this for a couple of other derivations that I'm just coming up. So basically it gives you an equilibrium level of income per capita that then determines the population. The first graph is just talking about birth rates and death rates, right? And the second graph is deriving the population. Are we clear with that? All right. You get the intuition? Okay. So now what happens if productivity increases? Let me give the answer to that. What happens if productivity increases? And we shift the curve. Is it? So what's happening? Productivity is increasing. Yeah. Total output has gone up. But then people start to have more children, population grows, and the equilibrium again comes back. Again, the main logic, and this is again a theory, it's a Malthusian theory, because we're being more productive, but we're equally having more people. This is again how the world kept in check throughout history. Technological increases were happening throughout, but then the resources are being spread over larger people. It's theoretical, but it's an intuition I think we want to keep in the back of our mind. Yeah? Productivity shocks translate into population growth, but not into growth in income per capita. We're talking about the denominator here. What happened when there's, actually Professor wants to talk through this in a little more detail, but just quickly, what happens when there's increased health services and the death rate comes down? What's happening here?
So if there's no attendant decrease in birth rate, then as shown there, income per capita gets even lower because now you have more people.
Right. To say that again, what gets income per capita gets even lower, despite health increases, right? According to this model.
Because you share the same body.
Ah, no, that. Okay. Okay, so this is what happens in a non-Malthusian model. Right? If the model is, if we don't follow what happens in the Malthusian world, there's something called urban agglomeration. That's one of the factors that we're talking about. What is urban agglomeration? And why does that change this graph? What does agglomeration mean?
Living together in a city.
That's again a very powerful concept behind Ricardo Hausmann's theory, right? Agglomeration. What does that do?
There's more people living in the same area, so
yes, yep.
It's
and
like a technological change for land or something.
Technological change for land because there's more people living in a certain area.
And
Okay.
yeah.
Some other yeah. Yeah.
There are a lot of efficiencies and cost savings from having everyone so close together, and there's a lot
Yep.
of knowledge transfer and technology transfer.
That's the really powerful concept of Hausmann's theory, right? When you have economic complexity, he talks a little bit about economic complexity that really brings equality, and convergence among this nation. That's the biggest factor that he talks about. But there's this element of urbanization that actually improves per capita income because people are closer together. You can produce more goods. There's a greater human capital component that's in close proximity, right? And that leads to development, which leads to greater income per capita. The thoughts on that? Yeah.
Is it the fact that people are living together that's leading to this increased productivity, or is it what they're doing when they live together, which is making machines and achieving economies of scale through economic activity?
Yeah, and that's what I mean. When you live together, you become more productive, you share human capital, so the alpha that you have in your solo model also goes up. So that's the thought, that when you have communities that are together, you start being more productive, and then you get more economic complexity. You start making more complex products, and you start making more sophisticated products more easily.
You're collectively more productive, not individually.
Correct. collectively more productive then, in this case, actually transfers to an increase in income per capita. Which is why this curve there, this is why you have the population curve actually increasing here. This red line is what happens to the black line. So that with an addition of population in urban areas, there's actually an increasing, there's a positive slope between population and income per capita.
This is proven.
This is what, yeah, I mean, this is, if you take a look at, society in the last 3-4 decades, and you look at urban areas, you will see, a faster rate of growth and an increase in income per capita.
So until the 60s, it was Malthusian, and since the 60s, it's Haussmannian.
In some countries. It's in some countries. Yeah. Right? And in some countries more than others.
I think he called the person by Haussmann.
Yeah, please explain that.
No, I mean, he says that in urban areas, the idea that you have, if you compare a person with bytes and or with computers, and you say, okay, so if you have more people that they are very good to produce certain type of products, so the product byte of this specific person will collectively increase the level of the complexity and productivity of every society or every country.
Yeah, it's a beautiful concept, a person byte. Beautiful illustration. You get more person bytes through economic complexity. But that's one case where the curve actually flows the other way. Yeah? Another example. Another non-Malthusian model. What's happening here?
Let me ask a question, sorry.
Yeah,
when you
that's
say
it.
non-Malthusian model,
Uh-huh.
are you talking about Professor Ricardo Haussmann's model?
No, not his. I mean, he doesn't have specifically an economic model. He has a theory on why some countries are poor, unequal, and volatile relative to others. So basically, I'm talking more about kind of the Malthusian era versus the modern era. Okay, and some of the reasons why this classical theory doesn't hold. It's explained a lot of life, for most of civilization, but there's been something that's been happening over the last 100 years. And then there's the post-industrial era and the modern era. What's been happening there? Okay, so what's happening here? Yes?
The opportunity cost of having a kid is growing with income.
Yes.
So if you have a high wage, 1 hour of your wage is a lot of money in the opportunity cost of allocating that hour in raising or nursing a kid is 1 hour of your wage. It will be
Exactly. So this is talking about, again, what we discussed a little earlier, about how people are changing, where actually increasing income is leading people to have fewer children. And I know I'm repeating this a couple of times, but I think it's remarkable, and it's an increasingly important factor in explaining what's happened in recent times. Why hasn't this happened in history before? Primarily because children were seen as additional labor. And that seems like a little bit of a crude and a kind of a selfish view of parenting too, right?
And the share of high-skilled labor was very little, right? So wages are more relevant nowadays than before.
Yep. Which is what Malthus calls the preventive shock, which wasn't even there in his time. I mean, I think these thinkers have been, Solo, Malthus, been so forward in their thinking. That's why we still study them today. Yeah.
Higher incomes have led to declining death rates, and so families are more confident that kids will survive past sort of infant mortality age. So you don't need to have 10 kids to have 3 kids that survive. You have to have 3 kids to have 3 kids.
But even that is, I mean, it's a really interesting phenomenon compared to how we think about it today, right? It's kind of thinking of children as economic assets. This is what most of history was about. It's really startling to me. You're power of the situation. If you're in there, this is the way the world thinks. That's what you think about. Have you guys played with Gapminder, the website? Yeah. What is it? Tell me the name.
Sorry, I'm Todd.
Sorry.
Gapminder is a data presentation website where, in addition to through the standard axes, they can play with like the size of circles on the graph and show the interaction between a number of variables at one time. over time.
Yeah, so what do the circles represent? The radius of the circles?
They can represent anything, but I imagine that you're thinking of sort of GDP of a country, or you can put it any data though.
Okay, so the circles actually represent the population of each country. The circle's always a fixed size, and then you basically see, I'll actually see if I can simulate that a little bit, but the reason I'm bringing this up is if you go to Gapminder, and if you see over time, how infant mortality has changed, and you correlate it with income per capita, you'll see these trends. The beautiful thing about this site is that it lists every country by the size of their population, and the color is based on the region that they're in. And then you hit the play button, and it shows from the 1900s, all the way to 2000, how things have changed, how the correlation of growth and income per capita has changed, how infant mortality has changed through time. So in 1950s, the infant mortality was, there was typically 50% in a lot of developing countries. So you would lose 1 out of every 2 kids. They wouldn't survive beyond the age of 5. So you would, you would produce. A lot of times, my great-grandmother had like 13 children. And there was like six of them survived. This is very common throughout. Okay, so this talks again about the change in the birth rate, where the graph is not upward sloping anymore; it's downward sloping. And this is again how you can escape the Malthusian trap, where the population will not correlate necessarily to the income per capita. You can have breaks against this rule. So the Malthusian equilibrium, what are the assumptions? Again, these slides will be available. The thought of the midterm and the problem sets is to just make sure that you get these principles. And I think relative to before, there'll be some quantitative rigor in a couple of questions which we'll go through, but the thought is we just want you to understand the principles and the assumptions of a lot of these models. So please take a look at these slides that summarize, but this is kind of the features of the Malthusian times in the Malthusian equilibrium. Right? Low productivity growth. This is a big assumption, which does not hold in the modern times, right? Hence, because of the low productivity growth, you have low population growth. Yeah. Then you have subsistence incomes. Incomes barely make subsistence. Just like in the solo model, you're assuming things like a closed economy, which is unreal right now, right? You're assuming things like perfect competition, which is also really rare to find. These are the assumptions here. And that there's high fertility and that there's high mortality too. Both of these phenomena don't hold true in industrialized nations in recent times. Yeah, what's it?
George, I'm sorry.
Yes.
So the interesting thing though is Malthus does work when there's a lack of governance.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And there are plenty of examples around the world. So we haven't talked about governance yet in this class, but that is another huge concept, and stability of good governance, which is also a multiplier in terms of being able to get out of Malthus' model.
So would you argue, would you say that most economies today, most in the world, have a level of governance where Malthus's principles don't really come in, and that some of the poorest ones, somewhere where the regimes are oppressive, have that characteristic?
I would. If I'm a fur tribesman in Sudan, Malthus is very close to me.
Mm-hmm.
But if I'm living in, central Germany, he's as far away as you can get.
You clear with that?
Yeah, I don't think that's so much due to governance as security. So if you're actively in a war zone, you're going to have the Malthusian constraints. But I think generally countries that are at peace, even poorly governed or tyrannical regimes, do
But
reasonably
who
well against
controls
conflict.
the power of violence?
Yeah, but that's what I mean.
The government does.
Right, but just basic security, not good governance, would be enough. So if you take, I don't want to pick on Eritrea, I don't know much about that, but it's not a very liberal regime, but they have security as opposed to some other.
Jeffrey, are you assuming that security is, and is it not a subset of good governance?
Well, no, that's why I picked the tyrannical regime like Eritrea. And so, in other words, just providing basic security seems to be enough. A lot of the other things that we would call governance are on top of that.
Interesting perspectives.
I would take exception to that, especially with Eritrea. Anyway.
Yeah, the thought is that, departure from Malthusian economics could, lead to, has often led to political upheaval too. Okay, Any questions here on the assumptions? You fairly clear with this? Okay. Once again, back to this. Growth in per capita income is again a historically recent phenomenon. You're going to see this again and again. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good question. One of the assumptions.
Yeah, let's go back.
Why are we assuming large gender gaps?
Okay, we'll come to that.
Okay.
Okay, and this refers to the fact that the number of women that actually get out to the workforce, that's and the number of women, the girls that get educated. And I'll come to the graphs where recent convergence in that has also been a factor that has explained greater per capita income. That's a good one, yeah. Okay. Seen this before. Look at this. Classic Malthusian economics during the time that we lived. What's going on here, Paul?
Okay, so, well, there's a lot going on there. There's, wages and population inverting at different points in the graph, and
So beautifully, right?
yeah,
You see.
mirror images of each other, almost, or certainly symmetry in the graph.
The black death.
I can't read
Yeah.
the okay, so yeah.
So here you just had the years from 1255 to 1735, and then you have real farm wages, approximation for GDP per capita. This really explains the black, at that time where in Britain, a lot of times when the population was increasing, there was a shock that got it back in control, and it had a reverse impact on the GDP per capita. Yeah.
Just a basic question. How reliable is this data? Like, surely the assumptions that would be required to be made to estimate real wages in 1255 would be
No, that's a good
pretty loose.
So Malthus, at that time, Malthus, he spoke mainly about Britain, and there wasn't the reason why his theories again were so revolutionary is because there was no sense of what's happening in the other end of the world. How many people in Africa? How is that growing? But his theory explained a lot of the world. My sense, I'll have to get back. I don't know the real answers to how reliable this data is, but the fact that Professor Hausman got it from somewhere and that someone's correlated it, implies that there's some reliability at least to a certain extent. But these data, they look like fairly detailed numbers. And I think even if you cut it out and take a look at any point, you'll see this inverse relationship. This classic Malthusian economics. This is what was going on in most of the world.
Bubonic plague and tuberculosis-related issues sweeping across.
There's a number of plagues. There's a Black Death. Yeah.
But then real income doubles, and population remains stagnant for a long time in the middle. And then actually income then starts to decline up to 1550 without population moving line. In the middle of the graph.
I see your point. I mean, right now on the graph you can see directly. Your question is right there when you're seeing an increase in population. Why is the income actually staying stagnant for that many years, right? Is this bad data that it's exactly the same? Clearly, I mean, we're talking about the 1200s, but I think directionally it really kind of proves the point.
Well, we also know though that during that time period, I mean, that was when the plague happened, which wiped out, some gigantic percentage of the world population. So obviously, at that point, per capita income, increased because there were so many fewer people, so drastically. I mean,
that's what
considering how closely this links with that historical event, I think it's more difficult to make the argument that this shows the Malthusian process. Because there's because of that drastic shock, which was external to the whole Malthusian process, was not necessarily related to population and income. It seems like it might present a sort of like a false evidence that his theory was correct. Because the drastic population decline, we can't really say was necessarily due to over-resource density, like too much resource depletion. Because of the plague.
Anyone want to respond?
Yeah, but you can read it the other way. You have drastic reduce of population, so you have much more per capita.
Well, yeah, I mean, you definitely have that. I'm just saying that because it corresponded to, because we know that the plague happened during that population dip, I think it's hard for us to draw a causal relationship between income and population decline.
So Dave, I think, okay, we can go a couple of, go back and forth on what caused what, but I think I like your point here, and I think this is what, personally, I think about economic theory too, right? At what point are we convinced, when we look at historical data, that there's some kind of correlation versus causation? I mean, I would just challenge, I don't necessarily want to support them versus your point. I love being the devil's advocate too, but I would just, I'll just challenge you. What are you saying that you really believe that there wasn't this correlation? Do you feel that this data is just by chance? Or is it strong enough? I mean, I guess it's a subjective decision where you kind of think about.
This is about correlation, not causality.
Agreed.
So,
Agreed. Yeah. But over 500 years, right? You see a pattern. And you don't know what causes what, but given that this is a theory, it's further strengthens the theory to most people. Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Oh, just a question. Is there a specific reason why we are using real wages instead of fee per capita here?
Well, I'm assuming that we didn't really have the data per capita, so it's much easier to get found
like a
wages
proxy
years.
for fee per capita.
Sorry, it's a proxy. It's a closest proxy.
Well, but it also, I was going to say that it suggests, such a large shock, I guess it's not that quick of a shock. It is occurring over 400 or 500 years, right?
Yeah, and even really just look over here. It's kind of hard to.
It's a simple. You can simply say that there was X amount of work to be done in this economy or in the European economy at this time, in England at this time. That work did not change. The amount of potential wage per capita, the amount of wealth per capita did not necessarily change in real terms, but simply that people disappearing created more wealth distribution.
This is your point, right?
Yeah.
The GDP per capita actually showed, if you take our population, it actually showed no real trend till the 19th century. And here we just correlated some of, some of the shocks here that happened and plague, and it shows this inverse relationship. But if you look at it individually, there was a lot going on. Yeah? And it fluctuated quite a bit. So if you abandon Malthus, right? And again, we discussed, we talk about two stages. Immediately the post-Malthusian era. It starts from somewhere in the 1820s or so until the modern era, which we'd say the last 60, 70 years. And here's what happened. There's faster productivity growth, endogenously and exogenously. There's initially the faster population growth that we had discussed. And then there was little increase in income per capita. When the transition to modern growth, this is what happened. Again, we've discussed this, that the productivity increases, again, happened much faster than the most optimistic economists and governments would have predicted in the 1960s. Right? There was a falling population growth, which some countries had seen a trend for, but then it became more of a global phenomenon. And there's almost a very good correlation today between income per capita and less number of children. Right. Rising real incomes. So that huge escalation that you see on the chart there, that is real income. We were significantly better off, like significantly than we can have the complexity of the products that we can own are just huge orders of magnitudes better than what an average person, not the aristocrat, was living even in the 18th century.
Just a question on the second point that you said, the falling population growth. You mentioned before that the population was increasing during the last century. So why is this?
So it's a relative. So basically, as initially as we said, first the death rates go down, and then there was this shift, this trend over the last 40, 50 years more than ever, where people chose to have lesser children. So that's why. So then initially, the greatest gap was when the death rate was going down and the population was kind of along that same trajectory. And the overall population fell when the birth rate was also starting to go down.
But again, you're not making any distinctions between developed or developing countries.
So this is well, in general, you've seen this phenomenon that as income per capita grows in developing countries too, that you're observing this phenomenon more than ever. But there are many exceptions. As Rwanda will come to that. There are still exceptions to that. And that's the question why, what's happening there. Right? But for most countries, this is what's happening.
So some countries are still in the, if we observe them, in the Malthusian.
Exactly. Exactly. That's a couple of slides. The Botswana, people argue, that is still to some extent, or Burundi actually, is still considered, are they really in, are they in the Malthusian trap still? Have they still not escaped it? And why so? Greater urbanization and declining gender gap. So there's some correlations that are coming up on the gender perspective. So okay, before that, let's just see how UK got out of the Malthusian world. Right? So here you're starting to see both the birth rate over time. So if you take a look at 1720 to 1930, you're going to see like there was this increase in the birth rate that the Malthus was explaining, then suddenly it started to go down, and go down pretty dramatically. Right? This is what the model is predicting. And the death rate too, which naturally goes down with increased income per capita. Right? And look what's happening here. What's that red line? Fraction of children between 0 to 14 years in primary schools. Education. I didn't think it would be this drastic. I didn't think that there was that much of a difference, between the mid-1850s and 1920s, and people not getting their children educated. Huge increase there. Right? So you're seeing now that the birth rate is going down, and historically you're seeing that there's a significant increase in the children going to school, and that is correlated with real GDP per capita going up. That's the beauty of macroeconomics, like over time with large numbers, you will start to see certain trends. Right? Great Britain, transition to modern growth. Fertility and the opportunity cost of children. Okay, so what's this red line? It's the female to male earning capacity. That is the ratio of how much a typical woman will earn compared to how much a man will. Okay? And the fertility, the typical fertility, which is going down. So there's two things happening. Women are starting to earn more wages. They're getting into more professions than before. This is from 1900s to 1990s, which again correlates to increased GDP per capita. And the fertility is also coming down drastically. Declining gap between genders, literacy rates. This is England 1840 to 1900. And that time England, you could say, was one of the most advanced societies, right, in the country, in the world. And look at that difference. Declining gap between genders. A very high correlation between when all of this is happening and when the world is becoming richer or more equal in terms of income. What are your thoughts, Cesar?
He's challenging you. He's asking,
Challenging
where are you in Benin right now?
No, in Benin we are making some
in Benin,
progress. Since the year 1919, we are experiencing a good education program, and then with the support of the international institution like UNICEF and USAID and other institutions, we are trying to overcome this gap, and then even we still have the line a little bit far from each other. The gap is going to become strength.
So what I really loved in what you said, it's very interesting, point of discussion is, with the aid of USAID, we are bridging the gender gaps. What is your thought on the role of institutions, global institutions, in making macroeconomic, sizable differences.
Exactly.
What are your thoughts, and what are some general thoughts on that?
I think
What is USAID doing?
I think they are promoting the education of the children, mainly the doctor education, by supporting the government and by supporting also the NGO action.
By funding or by action?
By funding,
okay.
and also by providing some material, material and technical support. They are also providing some technical support to the government and to the NGO. And they are acting in the field, on the ground, so as to strengthen this trend that is going to to be surely something in the next decade or 2 decades, we will reach certainly this level.
Okay, so this is lovely. I mean, there's so many people here in the room who've had experience with many of these organizations, right? And so even like the Clinton Foundation, where I worked, or the Gates Foundation, the thought was to kind of come into a country and be a catalyst, right? So you provide care, support, and treatment, for children with HIV. You kind of bring in these drugs, and you kind of create a system with the government that the government then takes on. Because a lot of this aid is finite by its nature, right? So even in, sort of reducing the gender gap, right? Are there some more perspectives on, do you feel like we've outlined a number of macroeconomic factors, do you feel that there's real value being added, by a lot of these international agencies that have come increasingly into many of the developing nations over the last 40, 50 years? And are there any, can you cite some examples of something that you feel would have worked?
I don't want to forget France. They are also doing so.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean,
you've been very optimistic. Like we launch this and then they go on. Most of the time they don't go on. So
I'm being sarcastic, and I'm kind of.
So like because money is driving policy, but when you don't have the money anymore, then
exactly.
I'm not.
So the challenge that we faced is in getting the government to actually continue our programs once we transition, right? But the question, the philosophy, I mean, when you talk about sort of convergence, getting, like raising the bar in specific criteria for countries, does it make sense to come in for a while? Is it the role of developed nations to come in and create this, this catalyst, and then leave after some time? Do you feel that's really aiding development? Is it increasing in the long run per capita income?
A big subject.
Right.
Big question.
Few minutes, why not? Yeah, George.
So let's look at Mali. Which
Mali,
which had boatloads of money dumped into it for aid over a period of time. A lot of it at the grassroots level. A lot of it targeted at gender gap issues. And literally overnight, you could say all of that effort was eliminated. And we are now back at a point where it's square one. All of that money, if you looked at it from an investment viewpoint, strictly economics, I'm not talking about people and kids and families on the ground. That was always all of that.
Why do you think that happened?
Well, I believe it happened because you did not have governance. You might have had rule, which I think is what you were getting at. So if you look at Afwerki in Eritrea, he's a ruler. He's not a governor. And look at Mali and the political situation that led to that. There was an ungoverned space which indicates poor governance, which allowed the situation to change like that.
Marcos, I want to ask you your thoughts. You've been in this field, you write about that. What is your thought? Thought on the impact of development aid, improving factors in the economy like gender ratio. It is.
It's a general question. Depends on the country, depends on the level of organization of the country, level of governance. So two general questions. This kind of aid, it's important to countries in a level of development or countries like Brazil or Mexico. So it's very difficult to answer this question.
I agree, but let's take something like this, so male-female ratio. And Cesar had said in Benin that USAID came in. And he made a good strong statement that they had an impact, a real impact. on the convergence of the male-female ratio here, or in sort of literacy rates. And in Mali, so you had the George, according to the example that he's seen, didn't have any impact. And of course it's general, but what are your thoughts in terms of overall? Do you feel that there's a role for it in gender?
It depends on cultural factors, depend on religion, for instance. Depending on the institutions, basically. I can't answer it.
Is your question whether?
In a general way.
Sorry.
Yeah, and I think
it's the question whether the institutions that have grown over the last 50 years.
In your experience, would you, if you end up working at USAID, right? Would you believe internally that you're making a real change in a developing country? I know it's general, but I think it's an important philosophical.
Yeah, the question just brings to mind some examples that I've, talked to other classmates about. For example, Solomon from Ethiopia, who's in a pretty high-level government position as a judge, right? Making decisions on behalf of the entire country in a very meaningful way. But then you have the IMF coming in, and you've got the World Bank coming in and sort of dictating with very, very, very strong dictation of, conditionality with regard to funding, changing, overhauling the entire system, overhauling the entire set of gender relationships. And so it's an interesting question because it gets to so many other things regarding the very long-standing traditions between gender, about gender issues between different countries, but also about conditionality requirements for funding and that kind of dual difficulty, I think. And so I just bring that up to say that it's extremely complicated. There are traditions that are deeply embedded in the fabric of some of these countries, and when funding is conditional on change of that nature, I think it's going to depend on the country. I think it's going to be very difficult.
For instance, what was the impact of the income per capita level in the gender gap in Saudi Arabia, Yemen?
Really? Yeah. No, I bring this up because there's two ways you can make it.
Yeah.
One is the internal government can continue to do things and spur things that have caused this huge change in the escape from the Malthusian trap. Two is that there's some responsibility that more developed countries can take. And I think for us as students, as many of us kind of thinking about going into these fields, I think you say a fulfilling job is one way you kind of believe. Clearly there's exceptions, it's hard to generalize. It's just an exercise that, I like to think about a number of times, and I'd love to have conversations. So do that. You want to add?
Sure, if you're up for one more.
Let's do one more.
My experience is working in the Balkans, which is very different than the least developed countries that we refer to. The Kosovo, where I spent a long time, is really at the low end of middle-income countries with a high end of low-income countries, but surrounded by middle-income countries. But the USAID type projects and other standard development assistance haven't really produced much in the way of growth. They already have the basics of institutions and a lot of focus on good government and democratization. But what they really need is to increase their productive base, probably the complexity of their economy, and to trade more. So they're actually overwhelmed by cheap imports from the neighboring countries. And it makes it very hard to generate competitive industry. And what they really need is some less of the neoliberal orthodoxy and more chance to develop exports. But that's not what USA type policy is. At least for their case, I'd be pretty skeptical.
Yeah. No, move on. There's clearly there's some catalyst to country self-sustainability and economy, and then there's some other organizations that look at many of these problems very specifically. And it's generally we can talk about it, but it's kind of interesting to just think about this actively. So again, the post-Malthusian versus the modern world. If you kind of break down, we've seen the Western offshoots, Western Europe. What's happening here on the left-hand side, US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, is that you see as the output is growing, right? You see this negative correlation between the population, which actually comes down. As the population is going down, the output is growing. But if you take a look at Africa in aggregate, right, you still don't see that trend. Same thing in Latin America. It's a little bit of a, something happening in the middle here in the early 1900s. But again, you see a population growth along with output growth. So at a macro level, can you argue that these continents in these areas are at different stages of development. Look at Western Europe too. Declining populations.
That's we're gonna die with a lot of money. This is awful, right?
That's a separate.
Nobody.
Yeah, and that's just happening here, right? It's happening right there.
Make children.
So the question remains, okay, so is some of the world still transitioning out of the Malthusian world? This is what happened in Burundi, right? So here, what we're seeing is that you have this is red line is GDP. This is total GDP, and if you see population, they're both increasing. And consistently, somewhat, and there was a little bit of a drop in the early 90s, but somewhat consistently from 1960 to 2010. Anyone aware of Burundi and kind of might be a factor that explains this?
Can I say something? I think the situation in Burundi is the same in different countries, sub-Saharan African different countries. The situation is similar, and that's what we are still experiencing right now. And hopefully, maybe that's why people in Africa, the economists in Africa are used to say the African is the upcoming investment continent, because with this trend, Africa will surely try to mobilize, capture the investment from the Western country and the developing country.
So your argument, correct me if I'm wrong, is that you're seeing this phenomenon because the country is on the cusp of developing in the post-Malthusian era, as we're seeing, right?
Exactly.
So right now the birth rates are still high.
Exactly.
Right?
Still high.
And the death rates, they are going down. So they continue to go down the same trend.
Yeah.
So you continue to seeing, there's only a few countries that fit this criteria right now. Right? We're seeing like sustained GDP growth, right? But you're also seeing continuation in population growth. Malawi also.
Exactly.
Same thing about Malawi. Right? Yeah, Malawi.
Can you go back to the photograph slide?
Which slide?
The one that compares Africa with.
Yeah, here.
That's, so here you're comparing GDP per capita to population growth. And in Burundi, you are comparing GDP.
Yeah, I don't know why Professor Hausman didn't show GDP per capita too.
Yeah.
But it's it's looking at, but it's basically showing that output is going up, overall output, and population is too. So on a per capita basis, yeah, you're right. This graph is a slightly different, it's showing slightly different axis on than the other one.
Excuse me, to understand. Is
Yeah.
it post-Malthusian or model when population is going down while output is going up? Is it the rule?
I mean, that's the thought.
It's
So there isn't a model that there isn't a post-Malthusian model. There is a Malthusian model that kind of interplays the birth and death rates, and it kind of says how you're going to get to equilibrium based on interplay of both. So the point about a post-Malthusian, and even more in the modern era, is that there's these other factors that we've never seen before that don't show this relationship. Right? So you're right. That's what it is.
So at the bottom they are still Malthusian or we don't know?
At the bottom over here. So here you can see this. I mean, these gaps are when on the lower scale that they would follow Malthusian. So mainly and you see that, I mean, the only study that has happened in that Malthusian era is in Britain and a couple of other smaller areas. So you really don't have, detailed studies. I mean, some of this is extrapolated. So but that's the thought, that there was something that happened until the 18th century, and then something new that's happened that doesn't fit this model, just like there was for Solo.
Yeah. Just in the graph, I just wonder if the modern theories, post-Malthusians, they're making some, they're taking into account, for example, some migration waves, because here you can see the population growth or the birth rate, But what about the population? You mentioned Western Europe or France, that people, or Spain, or Earth is decreasing over the time, but they are getting more and more migrants. So
Yeah.
I know if there is a model that it's taking into account this.
Do you think there's a substantial difference within European cultures of immigration in certain countries? That you So your point is because when, say, okay, you're saying that in an economy, as it progresses and there's greater GDP per capita, what's happening is not just endogenously, but from other countries, people are coming into those countries. And as a result, the GDP per capita is going down, right? Which is, in some ways, a different way of assuming that over time, the population within that culture increases, right? So the birth rate just, but now what you're seeing is through migration, you're going to see a more immediate kind of adjustment than it was intergenerational in the past.
And that's exacerbated too by the fact that immigrants tend to bring their reproductive mores with them for at least a generation or two when they switch across borders.
Yep.
So you have immigrant populations growing much more quickly than what older native populations in a place like Europe.
That's very true, and that's the thing about when you try to isolate one factor, with just another one. But this is a substantial point in recent times, right? But still, over time, you'll see certain trends. But absolutely, there's a lot of confounding factors of what's really impacting income per capita, anyways. But yeah, and it'd be interesting. I'm not aware, but it'd be nice to see if there are studies. And do you remember in that full day that Professor Hausman had? Did he talk about any of these? I forget that.
I don't think so.
Yeah. So Professor Hausman had a full day session for the Mason Fellows where he did this course in one day. Oh, was it? Was it all? Yeah. Okay, sorry, yeah, it was kind of sent out to, yeah. I apologize. So we kind of went through this course in about 8 or 9 hours. Okay? And I think that'll be great. I'd love to follow up on that too if there's some specific country information. So, okay, so this is what Professor Kamarol also wants to talk about. A lot of his research has gone in here, but how did the world abandon the Malthusian equilibrium? Right? Technology. There's a huge, huge jump, right? And there's this paper by Mokir that talks about this in detail. And the interaction between theory and application was another shift too. Okay, agriculture, the green revolution that we talked about, allowed for urban activities that were less intensive in terms of overall land. Right? Urbanization, we talked about agglomeration, deeper markets, this is a nice way of putting it, deeper markets, right? And the division of labor, which leads to specialization, which leads to better output, which leads to more income, right? And gender gaps, and the energy, even just the way energy has advanced. These are, this is again common sense, but the combination of all of this had a huge factor. Health, lower infant mortality triggered the lower desired family. Discuss this. Makes investment in human capital less risky. Very nicely put it. So Becker writes about the human capital element too. And if you change kind of the industry mix, and then you have smaller gender gaps and greater returns to schooling, which triggers a shift from quantity to quality. Right? Higher female labor force participation. More schooling. Positive. So this becomes a loop. So really, this is a nice loop where you kind of add up a lot of the factors. There is first, this demographic transition that we talked about. Right? Fertility decline, mortality decline. Combine that with education, better education, value for education, urbanization, and again, the cycle that both of those foster, which in turn, the education leads to greater technology, greater manufacturing exports, greater growth. Fairly intuitive, but I think what we'll do in the course will actually take a look at isolating many of these factors and trying to understand through different times in history for different countries which of these factors have been more important and perhaps why. Yeah. The transition to modern growth. So this is also what Professor Kamarol will touch in a little more detail last time. So these three interrelated decisions, right? around kind of more equality between gender and education, the fertility, the female labor force participation, and the education of children had a huge impact. Right? And the demand for children can be a function of the income, the overall income, the opportunity cost, and what was more factored in recent time, the happiness of the child, which in history wasn't considered as much. Right? And the labor force participation, again, is a function of the market income versus housework. Right? So there's both a shift. So technology is creating certain, some of the housework to be done a little better, to be done a little faster. Attitudes are changing. More women are coming into the workforce. More people are in the workforce. The more people leads to a cycle where the technology improves. And there's this vicious positive cycle that we've been experiencing in recent times. Seems like vicious doesn't seem like the right word, but it's this, yeah. And again, the education of children is a function of the income, the number of kids that you have, and the expected return to education. There's a huge argument. There's been a significantly high and growing correlation between education and the outcomes that it delivers. Right? As society becomes more complex, there's more specialized jobs. Certain training will lead to that specialized job, greater income will flow, the society becomes more better off.
Excuse me?
Yes.
The three, fertility, female labor, education, have been, he has put emphasis on those three specifically and not health or not other issues because he analyzed many different correlations.
Correct.
And these are the three who were the most significant.
So education for sure. Yeah, education for sure. Some of their research has actually looked at, as you said, lots of different studies to look at fertility. So this issue of fertility and female labor force participation was also a very recent phenomenon. Now, like all this, it's really hard to isolate the impact of that on income versus all the other factors. But they've studied these three factors. They feel that these three are interrelated. They reinforce each other, and that they have a substantial impact. I mean, health, in general, health had a huge macro impact to start with, but that was done, a little while ago too. Those advances, reduction in death rates, were from the early 1900s. This has been much more of a recent phenomenon. And this is more, the concept about this, Marie, is also that this is a decision, right? It's, the fertility implies a decision, a shift in current decision given changing situations in the economy. Okay, and this I kind of will do the last slide for today. Again, the demographic transition, this is a very important point. I think I just want to repeat it again. This is what happens traditionally for most societies as they go through stage of development. Okay? You have an equilibrium birth rate and a death rate. And first, the death rate starts to decline. So the peak population growth rate is during the time. So the biggest difference between the death rate and the birth rate before it starts to decline. Then the birth rate will come down too, and then you will have a point where you reach another equilibrium, where the demographic transition ends. So we'll discuss some of these concepts and also go through solo in the review session. I apologize we missed it because of the storm last time. I think with people's schedules, it's kind of go through that in detail. My apologies if I went through this. I got a call last night, and then I've been up all night to kind of go through these lectures. I think this is, this area is really fascinating for me too.
So when is the review session?
It's on Friday at 4 o'clock at RG20. And so we'll go through some of the graphical and the quantitative aspects of it. Right. Thank you.
I don't know.
defense of Mali, Mali was not an ungoverned space. It was invaded by Tuaregs and their Libyan slaves. I think you should put you together. I think that's too much to say. I mean, it was obviously too fragile for the challenge to face, but that's not what I think about it.
That's it. Just compelled. But you know what? Someone already has a digital version.
Empire was invaded. Oh yeah, that's right.
It didn't go well as well as it should have.
I mean, obviously.
It's